My life was perfect. At least that's what I kept telling myself. A beautiful home, a husband who loved me, and a best friend, Emily, who had been with me through everything. Emily wasn't just a friend, she was family. We'd known each other since childhood, sharing everything from secrets to dreams. I couldn't imagine life without her. She was like a sister to me, and when I got married to Mark, she was right there, celebrating every moment with us. It was her joy that felt like the final blessing over my life. But one rainy evening changed everything. Mark was working late, or so he'd said when he left that morning. I remember the day clearly, even the little things. I'd spent hours preparing his favorite dinner, wanting to surprise him when he got home, like I often did. But that night, as the clock ticked on and he still wasn't home, I started to worry. I kept checking my phone, watching the minutes pass. Midnight was nearing, and I still hadn't heard from him. Finally, my phone buzzed. Relief washed over me, until I saw that it wasn't Mark. It was Emily. Her voice was frantic, almost breathless. There had been an accident, she told me. She'd found him by sheer chance, she said. His car smashed on the side of the road, and she'd stayed with him, calling the ambulance, making sure he was safe. The words tumbled from her mouth, and I could barely keep up. All I could feel was my heart pounding, not out of jealousy or anger, but pure, unadulterated fear. In those moments, all I could think was, thank God she was there. When I saw him, bruised and bandaged, my heart broke and healed all at once. I couldn't stop thanking Emily. She'd saved him, and Mark's gratitude toward her was endless. In the following days, I noticed he would look at her with a softness, a kind of admiration that filled me with even more gratitude. She'd saved my husband's life. What else could I feel but gratitude? But slowly, a subtle shift began. Emily was around more often, helping out, staying late just to check in. Mark seemed to lean on her, not just for company but for comfort. They had this shared experience, something only the two of them understood, that seemed to place me on the outside. It was in the small things at first. They'd share glances, laugh about things I wasn't part of. I tried to ignore it, to chalk it up to the closeness that the accident had forced between them. But the feeling crept in, like a slow, creeping shadow I couldn't shake. When they'd exchange knowing looks, I felt like an outsider. Like I was intruding into something I should have been part of but wasn't. One evening, Emily stayed for dinner. As I watched them laughing, sharing these unspoken glances, a wave of unease settled over me. I tried to tell myself it was irrational, that I was just tired, overthinking things. But the feeling of dread gnawed at me, and I couldn't ignore it. It was almost as if something was slipping away from me, and I couldn't figure out what it was. I was losing them. No, I was losing him. And maybe I was losing her too. As the days turned into weeks, that unease only grew. Emily was practically a fixture in our home by now. Whenever Mark needed something, a drink, a pillow adjusted, help with the smallest thing, Emily would be there before I even had the chance to move. And he looked at her with a gratitude that sometimes felt like more. I brushed the thought away every time it crept into my mind. She's just helping, I told myself. He's only grateful because she saved him. But I started to notice little things that made it harder to convince myself. Once, when I was walking into the room, I heard them laughing together. It was just laughter, but it was the kind of laughter we used to share. Soft, private, as if no one else existed in that moment but them. And when I came in, their laughter stopped abruptly. They exchanged glances before Mark turned to me with a casual smile, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. "Hey, babe," he said, motioning me over. Emily was just telling me a story about that time in college. But as he continued, I noticed he couldn't quite meet my eyes. Emily's gaze was fixed on the floor, her face flushed. I tried to laugh along, to let it slide, but a coldness settled over me that I couldn't shake. The doubts were there now, planted like seeds, taking root in my mind. And they began to grow, feeding on every glance, every laugh, every awkward silence that followed when I walked into the room. One evening, Mark suggested that Emily stay for dinner again. He said it as if it was the most natural thing in the world, not even asking if I minded. And I realized it was becoming a pattern. He was the one inviting her, and she was the one accepting, as if this was her home too. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe I was overreacting. But when dinner was over and I caught Mark's gaze lingering on Emily as she talked, my heart sank. It was the way he looked at me once, back when we first fell in love. That spark, that admiration, and for the first time, I felt truly invisible in my own home. When she left that night, I decided to talk to him. We sat on the couch, the quiet between us heavy and tense. I looked at him, trying to find the right words, but everything sounded foolish in my mind. How do you say, "I think my best friend has taken my place in your heart," without sounding crazy? Finally, I took a deep breath. "Mark, do you think it's strange how much time Emily spends here?" He looked at me, surprised, a slight frown creasing his brow. "What do you mean? She's just helping out. I mean, she was there for me when I needed her most. I thought you'd be happy she cares so much." His words cut deeper than he could have known. Happy? I should be happy? I was grateful, yes, but this was different. "Of course I'm grateful," I said, forcing a smile. "It's just, I don't know, it feels like she's here all the time, like she's part of us." There was a pause, a silence so thick I could barely breathe. Then Mark reached out, taking my hand. "She's your best friend, Sarah. I would never. You're the one I love. You know that, right?" I nodded, his words offering little comfort, because while he held my hand, his gaze flickered. Not to me, but to the door, as if he were expecting her to walk back in. After that night, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to push it aside, to pretend like nothing had changed, but the cracks were too big to overlook. Emily kept showing up unannounced, always with some excuse. A new recipe she wanted me to try, a movie she thought Mark would love, a quick hello that somehow turned into hours. And with every visit, I felt more like a stranger in my own life. One afternoon, Mark mentioned he had a follow-up appointment with his doctor. I wanted to go with him, to be by his side. But just as I was about to offer, he told me Emily had already volunteered to drive him. He said it so casually, like it was the most natural thing in the world, as if I wasn't even an option. My heart sank. Why did he need her there? Why not me? I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, that it was just an innocent gesture from a friend. But later that evening, when Mark returned, something in him seemed distant, detached. I asked him about the appointment, about how he was feeling, but his answers were short, almost dismissive. And then, without another word, he went upstairs, leaving me alone with my doubts. That night, as I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, my mind raced with questions. Was I imagining things? Was I just insecure, letting my fears get the better of me? Or was there something real, something lurking beneath the surface that I didn't want to see? I replayed everything in my mind, every look, every laugh, every stolen glance that seemed to pass between them. It was like piecing together a puzzle, but no matter how many pieces I put in place, the picture was still unclear, leaving only a hollow feeling in my chest. Days passed, each one heavier than the last. I found myself watching them more closely, looking for clues, for anything that would confirm or deny the thoughts consuming me. And it was in those moments, those small, seemingly insignificant exchanges, that I began to see things more clearly. Like the way Mark would lean in just a little closer when he spoke to her, or how Emily's hand would linger on his arm a second too long. They were subtle, these gestures, small enough to pass as nothing, but enough to make my heart ache with every passing day. Then one evening, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. I wasn't trying to listen, but their voices drifted through the half-closed door. Emily was laughing, a light, airy laugh that felt so foreign in my own home. And Mark? I heard him laugh too, a sound I hadn't heard in what felt like ages. A sound he no longer made with me. A chill ran through me as I stood there, frozen in place. Part of me wanted to burst into the kitchen to confront them, to demand answers. But I held back, paralyzed by fear. What if I was wrong? What if this was all in my head? And yet, what if it wasn't? In that moment, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down into an abyss. I knew that if I took one more step, there'd be no going back. And so, I stayed quiet, watching, waiting, my heart breaking with each second that passed. That night, as I lay next to Mark, the space between us felt like an ocean. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched his arm, hoping for some sign, some reassurance. He turned to me, his expression unreadable, and for a brief moment I thought I saw a flicker of something, regret, maybe. But then he rolled over, leaving me alone with the crushing silence. And for the first time, I felt truly alone. Days turned into weeks, and each one felt heavier than the last. The doubts that once whispered quietly had now grown into a constant, deafening noise in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between Mark and me, that the laughter and warmth we once shared had drifted into something cold and distant. And Emily? She was everywhere, like a shadow I couldn't escape. I became obsessed with finding the truth, with understanding what had happened between us. I started paying closer attention, watching the way they acted around each other, catching every stolen glance and shared smile. But it wasn't enough. I needed answers. One night, after Mark had fallen asleep, I found myself going through his phone. I knew it was wrong. I knew it crossed a line. But desperation drove me forward, my hands shaking as I scrolled through his messages, his emails, looking for any sign, any clue that would confirm or deny the nightmare that had become my reality. But there was nothing. No messages, no photos, no hidden chats, just an empty inbox and a call log that only made me feel more foolish. I wanted to cry, to scream at myself for doubting him, for letting my suspicions turn me into someone I barely recognized. And yet, something still felt off. The doubts didn't go away. If anything, they only grew stronger. The next day, Emily came over, unannounced as usual. She and Mark were laughing about something as I walked into the room, their voices silencing the moment they noticed me. An awkward silence hung in the air, and I felt that familiar ache in my chest, that gnawing feeling that I was an outsider in my own home. "Hey, Sarah," Emily said, her smile wide and bright. "I was just telling Mark about this new cafe I found. We should all go together sometime." I forced a smile, nodding politely, but inside, I was burning. The invitation felt hollow, a formality, as if she knew I wouldn't really be there. When she left that evening, I decided I needed to confront Mark again. This time, I wasn't going to hold back. I couldn't go on like this, drowning in uncertainty, feeling like a stranger in my own marriage. As he sat down on the couch, I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts. "Mark, we need to talk." He looked at me, his face unreadable, and nodded. "Okay, what's on your mind?" I just feel like something's changed between us," I started, my voice barely a whisper. "You and Emily, it feels like there's something going on, something I'm not part of. I just want to understand what happened to us." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, his gaze fixed on the floor. For a moment I thought he was going to deny it, to brush off my concerns like he had before. But then he looked up, his expression softening. "Sarah, nothing's going on," he said, his tone calm and measured. "Emily's been a friend to both of us for years. She was there for me during a tough time, and I'm grateful to her for that. But that's all there is. I promise." I wanted to believe him, to let his words soothe the pain in my chest. But there was something about the way he spoke, the way he avoided my gaze, that only deepened my doubts. "Then why does it feel like I'm losing you?" I whispered, my voice cracking. He reached out, taking my hand in his grip firm but distant. "You're not losing me, Sarah. I'm right here." But as he said those words, I could feel the emptiness between us growing, a chasm that no words could bridge. And in that moment, I realized that the man I had married, the man I thought I knew, was slipping away from me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The days that followed were like a blur, each one bleeding into the next, filled with silence and uneasy glances. Mark's reassurances had done nothing to ease the storm inside me. If anything, they had only deepened the cracks. The man I once trusted with everything felt like a stranger, and Emily, she was everywhere, filling every space I thought was mine. One evening, I decided I couldn't take it any longer. I needed to get out, to escape the suffocating atmosphere that had taken over my home. I grabbed my coat and left, my mind too clouded with frustration and doubt to think about where I was going. I just walked, my feet carrying me down familiar streets that offered no comfort. Eventually, I found myself at a cafe, a quiet, dimly lit place where Mark and I used to go in the early days of our relationship. Back then, everything had been so simple, so full of promise. Sitting there alone, surrounded by memories, I felt a strange mix of nostalgia and grief. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through old photos, pictures of Mark and me, smiling, holding hands, laughing together. The happiness in those images felt like a cruel reminder of everything that was slipping away. I wanted to go back to that time, to a version of us that hadn't been touched by doubt and betrayal. My phone buzzed, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was a message from a mutual friend, someone who hadn't been in touch for a while. Her words were casual, almost cheerful, but they hit me like a punch to the gut. "Hey, I just ran into Mark and Emily. They looked so happy together. Thought you might be with them, but I guess not. Hope you're doing well." I stared at the screen, my hands trembling, my heart pounding in my chest. They were together, now, without even mentioning it to me? My mind raced, 1,000 thoughts colliding, each one more painful than the last. The final pieces were falling into place, forming a picture I had been too afraid to see. I sat there for what felt like hours, the cafe growing emptier as the evening wore on. Part of me wanted to go home, to confront them, to demand answers. But another part, the part that was tired and broken, knew that whatever answers they gave wouldn't change the truth I was beginning to accept. When I finally left the cafe, the walk back home felt like a march towards something inevitable. I was numb, each step heavy with dread. My mind replaying every interaction, every laugh, every lingering glance that had passed between them. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, each one more damning than the last. As I approached the house, I saw the faint glow of lights from the living room window. They were home, probably laughing together, sharing the same jokes and stories that used to be mine. With a deep breath, I opened the door, my resolve hardening with each step. When I walked in, they both looked up, startled, as if they hadn't expected me. "Oh, hey, Sarah," Emily said, her voice overly cheerful, as though everything were perfectly normal. But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of guilt, maybe, that betrayed her. I looked at them both, feeling the weight of everything I had carried for so long. And in that moment, I realized that I couldn't keep pretending, couldn't keep lying to myself. "Were you ever going to tell me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, each word laced with pain and betrayal. Mark's face fell, his expression shifting from surprise to something that looked like regret, maybe even shame. Emily glanced at him, her smile faltering, and for the first time, I saw the truth in their silence. And just like that, my world shattered. The silence that followed was deafening. Mark looked away, unable to meet my gaze, and Emily's face turned pale, her usual cheerful demeanor slipping away like a mask she could no longer hold up. I could feel the weight of everything I had been trying to ignore, everything I had wanted so badly to be untrue, crashing down around me. I took a shaky breath, my voice steady but barely holding back the tears. "I just need to know, when did it happen? When did you two decide that I wasn't enough?" Mark's head shot up, a flicker of panic in his eyes. "Sarah, it's not like that," he stammered, but his words felt hollow, empty. He reached for my hand, but I pulled away, stepping back as if his touch might break what little composure I had left. "Then explain it to me," I said, my voice cold. "Explain why my best friend and my husband are always together, why you're sharing things I'm no longer a part of. Explain why she's more a part of your life than I am." Emily opened her mouth to speak, but she hesitated, glancing at Mark as though waiting for his permission to say something. And in that moment, it was clear that whatever they had, it was real. They didn't need to say it out loud. It was written in their eyes, in the guilty looks and stolen glances. I felt a wave of anger rising inside me, the betrayal and heartbreak morphing into something darker, something fierce. I had loved them both. I had trusted them, shared everything with them, and they had taken that love, that trust, and turned it into something ugly. "Sarah?" Mark's voice was soft, almost pleading, but it only fueled the rage bubbling within me. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I never meant for this to happen." I let out a bitter laugh, the sound hollow in the quiet room. "You didn't mean for it to happen? Then why did you let it? Why did you let her take my place?" Emily stepped forward, her expression torn between guilt and defiance. "Sarah, you have to understand, Mark and I, we just connected. After the accident, we spent so much time together, and it just happened." Her words were like a slap in the face, each one cutting deeper than the last. It just happened. The same words I had told myself, trying to justify the endless visits, the late-night laughter, the growing distance between Mark and me. But hearing them from her, from my best friend, was something else entirely. I felt a chill run down my spine as the final pieces clicked into place. I had lost them both, the two people I had cared for most in the world, and they hadn't even thought enough of me to end it cleanly, to spare me the pain of finding out this way. I looked at them both, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. "You know," I said quietly, "all I ever wanted was for the people I loved to be happy. I guess I just never thought that would mean losing everything." Mark tried to reach for me again, his face stricken with regret, but I stepped back, my mind already made up. I couldn't stay here, not like this. The love I had for him, for both of them, was still there, but it was buried under layers of hurt and betrayal that would never fully fade. With a deep breath, I turned and walked toward the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. I could hear them calling my name, their voices laced with desperation, but I didn't look back. I couldn't, because for the first time, I knew that leaving was the only way I could reclaim the pieces of myself they had broken. As I walked away that night, leaving behind the life I had built, I felt like a part of me was breaking, shattering with every step. The pain was raw, almost unbearable, but somewhere beneath it was a strange sense of relief. I had finally let go. The weight of carrying around their betrayal, their lies, it was gone, lifted from my shoulders. And though I felt empty, I also felt free. In the days that followed, I tried to keep my mind busy, focusing on the little things. I would wake up early, go for walks, find new places to explore, reminding myself of who I was before I became wrapped up in them, in us. The house was quiet, painfully so, but in that silence I began to find a sense of peace. It was as though I was meeting myself for the first time in years, discovering pieces of myself I had long forgotten. One day, as I was going through some old boxes, I found a photograph of Mark and me from our first anniversary. We looked so young, so happy, our smiles bright and full of promise. I stared at it, feeling a pang of sadness mixed with something close to acceptance. That version of us was gone, replaced by something I could no longer recognize. But for the first time, I felt ready to let it go. I started doing things I had always wanted to do, things I had put off because they didn't fit into our life together. I signed up for a painting class, something I'd mentioned wanting to try for years but had never gotten around to. I joined a book club, met new people, and began to fill my days with the things that brought me joy, small though they were. Each day was a step toward rebuilding, toward finding the pieces of myself that had been lost. And then, one evening, as I was leaving the painting class, I saw Emily. She was sitting alone in a cafe across the street, looking almost as broken as I had felt in those first days. Our eyes met through the window, and for a brief moment neither of us moved. She looked away, guilt and sadness etched on her face, and I felt a surge of emotions rise within me. Anger, betrayal, but also a surprising sense of pity. I realized then that while she and Mark had taken everything from me, they hadn't really won. They had each other, but at what cost? They had destroyed the trust, the love, the friendships that had bound us, and now they were left with the ashes of what we'd once had. And as I looked at her, I felt something shift within me, a release of the anger that had kept me tethered to the past. Turning away, I walked home with a lighter heart. I didn't need revenge or an apology to move forward. What I needed was to rebuild myself, to let go of the hurt and find my own happiness. And slowly, day by day, I was doing just that. In the months that followed, I found myself growing stronger, more resilient. I realized that losing everything hadn't been the end of my story. It had been the beginning of a new one. A story that was mine alone. One where I was no longer defined by the people who had hurt me, but by the strength I had found in leaving them behind. For the first time in a long time, I was at peace. As time passed, the pain faded, like a scar that no longer hurt but would always remind me of what I'd survived. I hadn't just lost my husband and best friend, I had lost a part of myself. But in losing that, I had found something far more valuable. The strength to rebuild, to start over, and to write a story that was mine and mine alone. Months turned into a year, and life found its own rhythm. I moved out of the house Mark and I had shared, finding a cozy apartment filled with light and warmth. I painted the walls with colors I loved, filled the space with books, plants, and art that made me smile. It was my sanctuary, a place that was truly mine, untouched by the memories of a life that felt like a distant dream. One afternoon, while organizing a bookshelf, I came across an old journal I had kept in the early days of my marriage. Flipping through its pages, I saw a version of myself who was so hopeful, so willing to give everything to make someone else happy. That girl was gone now, but I didn't feel sad. I felt grateful. To her, to the woman who had loved deeply, who had sacrificed, who had learned the hard way to hold on to herself. I went on with life, pursuing the things that brought me joy. I painted, I traveled, I surrounded myself with people who lifted me up, friends who valued me for who I was, not for what I could give. And with each passing day, the memories of Mark and Emily became fainter, like whispers in a crowded room. Then, one evening, I was out with friends at a cafe when I saw Mark. He looked older, his face etched with lines of regret. His eyes met mine, and I saw a flicker of the man I once loved, but also a man who had lost something irreplaceable. He walked over, his movements hesitant, as if he wasn't sure he had the right to approach me. "Sarah," he said, his voice soft. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything." I looked at him, feeling nothing but a quiet sense of closure. I didn't need his apology, not anymore. But as I stood there, I realized that maybe he needed to say it as much as I needed to hear it. "I forgive you, Mark," I replied, my voice steady. "I hope you find what you're looking for." He nodded, his eyes filled with a sadness I couldn't quite place. And as he walked away, I felt a weight lift, as if I was finally free of the last remnants of that chapter of my life. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by the things that brought me peace, I realized that I hadn't lost everything that day. I had gained a new beginning, a chance to rewrite my story on my terms. I had survived, I had grown, and I had found a strength I never knew I possessed. And as I looked out at the city lights, I smiled, knowing that the best part of my life was just beginning. If you found yourself drawn into Sarah's journey of heartbreak and healing, make sure to subscribe to Soul Narratives for more stories that touch the soul. Each tale dives into the raw, real emotions we all face, from love and loss to redemption and resilience. Don't forget to like, share, and let us know in the comments. What would you have done if you were in Sarah's shoes? Join us again soon, where another story of strength awaits.